And then after, for example, in this particular case, this is the US president's, this initiative started by President Mr. Bush to help those in HIV. So what they were doing is shipping directly to the countries. And what the Americans thought about was, well, maybe instead of each country ordering to the manufacturer and then being delivered, what if we put a regional distribution center, and the distribution center orders? Well, first of all, part of the problem was each country was ordering separately. We have a lot of challenges. The road infrastructure doesn't work very well. And then we talked about the fact that the patients don't always take the medicine. There's also, it's very hard to train people in logistics in the countries to manage their supplies properly, although it's getting a lot better. So the idea was, PEPFAR, I was mentioning the US President's Initiative for AIDS Relief, that started this group called the Supply Chain Management System. And how about if you put a regional distribution center, and now the distribution center orders from all the countries, and from the regional distribution center, you pool many countries in one place, and from there, you deliver to each country. So that's what they did. They being people of action, they implemented one, but when they implemented it, they really didn't know whether this idea was better or not. So what we did here was, well, in theory, you're supposed to have lower cost, more security, and lower lead time. Lead time is very important. It's the time that goes between the moment when I order something until it's delivered to me. So if I order today and it takes a long time for things to be delivered, I have to today think about what will I need in the future when the things arrive. Just to give you an example, in the fashion industry, the average lead time used to be 7-8 months. If you buy from a cheap, faraway country, it takes a long time between design and planning and then the actual shipment and everything. That means today I have to know what I will need in 8 months. If I reduce the lead time, then I don't have to guess. The thing is, that was an idea, but did it work or not? So here's where we came in and studied that problem in particular, and tried to do what's called a before and after study to measure the effects. So we built a model, and we started measuring the actual numbers. We did interviews, data collection, and so forth. We picked that warehouse in South Africa. How much time do I have, Professore? 5 minutes. Perfect. It's good to have. When I teach, I have a big clock, and I always look at the clock. But here, it's not so easy. I can always use the excuse that I'm from Argentina and we're a little bit informal, but that would get me in trouble. Yes, so I was saying we pick one regional distribution center, and the question is it doing better than before or not? There are some things that are still being delivered directly to the customers, to the countries, but we picked ARV, which is antiretroviral treatments, which is the treatment you have to take if you do have HIV. And then what we looked at is, this is the actual numbers, this is the countries of origin of ARVs being shipped, and essentially a big percentage of them come from India. So we picked India, although the United States is another big donor, big source. The biggest source of cheap, reliable antiretroviral drugs, retroviral drugs for that particular location is India. So we looked at what happened before was India was shipping to all of these countries, and then the new idea was, what if you put a distribution center? Simple enough. Well, like everything, God or the devil is in the details. So the question was, well, first pick which medicines. And then we did another Italian idea, the Pareto principle. Wilfrido Pareto is another famous Italian who essentially said, well, he said many things actually. Mr. Pareto was a Renaissance man in the sense that he was in many, many different things. But in this one in particular, he said, well, usually a small percentage of all the medicines or of all the things represent a big percentage of the total expenditure. It is usually known as the 20-80 rule. 20% of the medicines represent 80% of the cost. And we looked at this, and indeed, this is what happened. Mr. Pareto is alive and well, with only studying a little bit of only some of the medicines. Almost, we could study almost 80, 90% of the total expenditure. So we picked those, just to begin. Then we had to do, of all of those, calculate more or less, because we want aggregate numbers, total numbers. So we calculated what's called a weighted average of the costs. What happens essentially with inventory, it's a trade-off. Inventory is always a trade-off. If I have a lot of inventory, I can supply a lot. I have my customers very happy. But I have a lot of money immobilized. Inventory costs money. And that money I could have used somewhere else. The other good thing about having a lot of inventory is I order every once in a while, and it's cheap to order because I make an order a year, for example. I place the order and I forget about it and the inventory is there. On the other hand, if I have very little inventory, it's hard to keep up with demand, but I'm always ordering, and ordering is not so easy. In manufacturing, in medicines, the order process is very complicated. Each time I order, you incur a cost. So it's a balance. And we had to calculate both. And here, the service level, which is, how do you make sure you cannot have the medicines 100% of the times for 100% of the people? Because demand fluctuates. It's an uncertain problem. So, and what is the true service level, which is when the countries order, if they order from the regional distribution center, the lead time is very short. But if the regional distribution center runs out of stock, then the center has to order upstream. So you had two lead times. The lead time from the vendor to the center and the lead time from the center to the country. And then in the old situation, you had only one lead time, but longer, from the vendor to the country. So you have to compare lead times, compare inventories, and see what wins. Transportation too. Each country is different. What happened was the countries were buying, it was very long lead time, it took them a lot of time to process the orders, and essentially by the time they placed the order, they wanted air shipped. So everything was flying into the countries before. Now if you have inventory locally in Africa, in South Africa, when the country needs something, you can deliver closer distance. Maybe you don't need airplane all the time. And you save a little money on the transportation, or maybe a lot of money. So now that means you have some, this is called buffer stock. You have some stock there in the distribution center, in the regional distribution center, for example, in South Africa. So maybe you can use a little bit more of ship to travel from India to South Africa, because if there's an emergency or you need something, you have some there already in Africa. So you can save some transportation cost. And so we have to compare the transportation cost. And in the end, what happens is the inventory behaves non-linearly, actually. So it is not obvious to see how everything will end up. Well, it's like everything else. I don't want to go into details. It's obvious once you understand it. It's like there's a small internal joke at Harvard. One of my professors was once teaching, and a colleague of his who was also teaching in the class, he said, and it's obvious to see that from this equation, this will happen. And the other professor was watching, didn't say a word. And he came back the next week, after a whole week, and he said, Professor so-and-so, I've been thinking the whole week about it. I wrote a lot of equations, about 20 pages of equations he showed, and he showed it on class. And I think now you're right, it's obvious. Yeah, only obvious after you understand it. So things are not obvious, never obvious. If you think the details and if you are subtle about the full implications of things, things take time. But in the end, this is what she did. She ended up, I said she because this is a student of ours from the Dominican Republic who's now in Switzerland working for one of the big pharmaceutical companies. And she did a full model of the cost of the before and after they implemented this regional distribution center. And in essence, yes, the Americans were right, and you could save 10 million euros, sorry, dollars. Which was, if you look at the total cost before, you're talking 10 million in 48 million, so that's about 20% savings, which is a significant saving. Just to give you an idea, supermarket like Carrefour maybe makes 5% of their sales, that is a profit. Only 5% margin, net margin. So 20